Good afternoon, Excellencies. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of those who are joining us online today. I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of IDMC's 2023 Global Report on Internal Displacement. My name is Alexandra Bilak, and I'm very pleased to see so many of you here today. Before we begin, I need to inform you that we have simultaneous translation in both French and Spanish. So for those of you here in the room today, please feel free to take some headphones, and you can press a button, I believe, on the side of the black box to choose your language. And for those of you joining us online, there's also an interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. It should be rather self-explanatory. The report that we're publishing today is the result of months of work by all of my colleagues at IDMC. So I would like to start by extending a warm thank you and heartfelt congratulations to all of them for producing this important report. In a few minutes, I'm going to be joined on stage by a panel of guest speakers who I'm looking forward to introduce to you all shortly. But before I do so, let me just say a few words about the report and about why we're here today. Once again, this year's grid paints a rather bleak picture of the world. There have never been so many people internally displaced globally. There are roughly twice as many today as there were a decade ago, and more significantly, 20% more than only a year ago. Many new records were broken last year. The war in Ukraine has resulted in the fastest growing internal displacement crisis that IDMC has ever had to monitor. And in addition to this, major floods in Pakistan, drought in the Horn of Africa have caused unprecedented numbers of people to lose their homes. But as you'll see from the report, these events were sadly not the only events that triggered displacement in 2022. Once again, new and protracted conflicts, as well as sudden and slow onset disasters from the Americas to the Pacific, forced millions more people to move last year. Now, we mustn't forget that behind these numbers that are so huge as to almost be unimaginable, there are people. There are children, there are women, there are men, each with their individual stories, with their individual needs and their own aspirations. People who right now are working very hard to rebuild the lives that they've lost. It's also important to remember that although internal displacement affects every country and region in the world, its impacts are felt at different scales and at different intensities. And one common thread across all these countries is that it invariably affects the poorest and the most vulnerable people hardest. And more often than not, it leaves them in situations of prolonged displacement that can have far-reaching consequences for themselves, but also for their children and for future generations. Now, last week, we saw another very sobering report being published, the Global Report on Food Crises, that showed that the number of acutely food insecure people in 2022 was the highest recorded in the 7-year history of this report. Now, when we were researching this year's grid, the IDMC monitoring team was struck by how regularly the issue of food security came up in the stories that they were reading about displacement. It's become more and more difficult for us, and in general for all of us, to disentangle one trigger of displacement from another, as more and more countries are experiencing the combined effects of political instability, of disasters, of climate change, and indeed of food insecurity. And these combined effects are creating ever more urgent and ever more complex needs among IDPs. The first thing we found when looking at this issue was that there is a visible overlap between many of the countries with the highest numbers of IDPs and countries that are currently experiencing crisis levels of food insecurity or higher. Across several contexts that we looked at, food insecurity is worse for IDPs, and the experience of displacement can aggravate the conditions and the well-being of already vulnerable food insecure people. Another thing that struck us when developing this report is that while data on food security and data on internal displacement is by and large available, data on the relationship between these two phenomena is still lacking. So as a result, we still know too little about, for example, the specific needs and vulnerabilities of IDPs who are experiencing food insecurity. We still know too little about the conditions in which food insecurity can either trigger or in some cases hamper displacement. And we know too little about the way in which displacement, particularly displacement that becomes protracted or repeated, can have a knock-on effect on people's nutrition, on their health, and over time also on wider food systems. But what does seem clear to us, despite all of this, is that if we don't reduce the scale of both displacement and food insecurity, and if we don't tackle their compounding impacts, we will not have a world free of hunger by 2030, which is a key pillar of the Global Sustainable Development Agenda. So this report is a clear call for action. It calls for improving the understanding of the relationship between these two phenomena, but it also proposes to look at food security as a potential positive accelerator of solutions for people forcibly displaced. I think it makes a very compelling case for bringing together solutions to food insecurity and solutions to internal displacement. And it makes a case also for building on the concrete examples and the lessons from around the world that can help slow or even reverse these trends in the future. But more importantly, perhaps, what this report does is that it reinforces the idea that IDPs, who are themselves the farmers, the consumers, the entrepreneurs, that IDPs can and should play a central role in these solutions. So we hope that this report can provide a solid basis upon which to build policy and to inform future data collection and analysis in the future. So this is really just the beginning of a journey for IDMC. We plan to include this topic to our monitoring and research priorities, but also to our policy work and to future capacity strengthening initiatives. We look forward to consolidating the partnerships that we've already built in preparing for this report and to working closely with all our partners, to whom today I extend our deep gratitude for their collaboration with IDMC. A special thank you to the Food and Agriculture Organization, to the World Food Programme, Impact Initiatives, Save the Children, of course our mother agency, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and many more. Before I give the floor to our esteemed keynote speaker, I would just like to say that this year marks an important milestone for IDMC as we celebrate 25 years of work since our establishment in 1998. We'll celebrate this anniversary at our annual conference on the 2nd of October with a reflection on a quarter of a century of progress, but also a look to the remaining challenges ahead when it comes to preventing, addressing, and resolving internal displacement. On this important anniversary year, we look forward to continuing our close collaboration with the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of IDPs, as well as the Secretary General's Special Advisor on Solutions to Displacement. These are two mandates that are absolutely critical in preparing the next decade of action. And finally, another key moment this year, later this year, will be the 20th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, COP28, in the United Arab Emirates, where we hope to see ambitious commitments by governments to avert and to minimize the losses and damages resulting from climate change that aggravate the global food crisis and aggravate people's vulnerabilities. Thank you, and I now give the floor to Ambassador Tina Merck-Smith. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Let's see. Dear friends and colleagues, in the northeast of Colombia, near the border to Venezuela, in one of the regions most affected by conflict, lies the town of Arauca. Along the main road, next to a muddy swamp filled with garbage, families live in makeshift settlements built from corrugated iron, tarpaulin, and recycled materials. These improvised shelters belong to the Jivi people, an indigenous group who traditionally has moved freely in a vast territory that spans across the Colombian and Venezuelan sides of the border. A year ago, due to fighting between armed groups, they were displaced from their village on the Venezuelan side and are now stranded in Arauca without opportunity to cultivate the land. They are without access to food systems to provide for their livelihoods, without proper documentation, without sustainable prospects. The Jivi people find themselves in the midst of a complex displacement crisis, compounded by poverty, lack of protection, and armed conflict, in a country where food insecurity doubled in 2022. Earlier this year, I had the privilege to meet with representatives from the Jivi people when visiting Colombia together with UNHCR. I saw firsthand how IDMC's data is used by the Colombian government and humanitarian organizations. I saw how it's used to design and implement effective responses. Colombia boasts one of the world's most advanced registries on internal displacement. Sadly, however, Colombia also has one of the highest numbers of IDPs globally. Over 7 million people have been forced to leave their homes due to the decades of conflict and violence. The protracted conflict has forced many farmers to relocate permanently to urban areas. Non-state armed groups have imposed movement restrictions, so-called confinement, that again have hindered the production and transportation of food. This has created a twofold problem. Displaced communities who rely on agriculture for their livelihoods are unable to produce and sell food. At the same time, their confinement intensifies food insecurity. The challenges faced by these displaced communities illustrate the urgent need, the urgent issue of food insecurity. The emphasis of this year's global report on internal displacement could not be more timely. So it is a pleasure and an honor to be here today to launch the GRID report of 2023. Norway has had a long-term commitment to find durable solutions for internally displaced people. Norway also has a strong engagement for food security, and we are a long-standing partner of IDMC and your important work. This year's publication and earlier IDMC reports have clearly shown when vulnerability increases, displacement often follows. Conflicts, natural disasters, and the COVID-19 pandemic have intensified pre-existing inequalities. Protection needs are on the rise. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has fueled what was already becoming a global food security crisis, a crisis in which the poorest and most at-risk populations, including IDPs, are hardest hit. We cannot afford to become complacent. We cannot accept ever higher numbers of displaced persons as the new normal. We must instead join efforts in reversing this tragic trend. When it comes to solving internal displacement, there is no substitute for political will at the national level. Yet, the international community must also step up and contribute. The Secretary General's Action Agenda on Internal Displacement, adopted last year, is a robust plan to follow up the recommendations of the high-level panel from 2021. I am encouraged that the Secretary General is putting emphasis on finding solutions to these crises through the appointment of a special advisor. This is a big step in the right direction, and we should not miss the momentum. So what we know is that to find solutions to internal displacement, well, that requires quality data. Without it, we lack a vital evidence base to inform policies to prevent, respond, and achieve longer-term solutions to displacement. IDMC's work is instrumental in filling this gap. IDMC has been providing the gold standard of data on IDPs for, as Alexandra just said, more than 25 years. And your expertise and experience in this field is invaluable. The report's latest data and analysis shed light on the relationship between displacement and food insecurity, highlighting gaps in our understanding and our interventions. By exploring the potential for a more integrated approach, we can hopefully better address the challenges that displaced communities face in accessing food. We must acknowledge that food insecurity is a driver of forced displacement, and forced displacement is a driver of food insecurity. Food security and climate adaptation are interlinked, and climate change is a brutal reality for farmers and fishers in various parts of the world. Small-scale farmers are the backbone of local food security, and they need our support. For every dollar spent on food security in rural areas, we save $10 in humanitarian assistance, according to the FAO, WFP, and the World Bank. Norway has recently adopted a new strategy, combining forces against hunger, a policy to improve food self-sufficiency. We are stepping up our efforts. We will focus on sub-Saharan Africa, a region which accounts for 60% of all people living in extreme poverty, and with 25 million IDPs. Our strategy recognizes that food is a human right. The authorities in countries where people are hungry or starving have a duty to secure food for all inhabitants. However, to fulfill this duty, countries must have the necessary framework and resources. The gender dimension is also closely linked to displacement and food security, and we know that women and girls are often at a higher risk of displacement and often especially affected by food insecurity. So closing agricultural gender gaps, for instance, has the potential to economically empower women and support food production. Norway's own experience through our history has shown that women's employment can be a central driver of inclusive growth. Without addressing gender inequalities and empowering women, food security will remain an elusive goal. In closing, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the entire IDMC team for their invaluable work on collecting and analyzing data on internal displacement, and for dedicating this year's grid to the interlinkages between internal displacement and food security. Your commitment to this critical issue continues to inform and guide policy decisions and interventions, impacting the lives of millions of people. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Smith, for these words. And as you said, Norway is a leader when it comes to or at least a thought leader and an operational leader when it comes to addressing both internal displacement and food insecurity, and of course has been one of IDMC's most trusted partners over this last quarter of a century. So very glad that you could come and give the keynote speech. Without any further ado, and before we turn to our panel for the discussion, I'm now going to hand over to IDMC's global and regional analysis. He's no longer a region, is he? Yes? Apologies, I thought that was a mistake in the title. IDMC's global and regional analysis manager, Mr. Vicente Anzellini, who's also the coordinator of our global report and who's going to be presenting to you the findings of this year's grid. Over to you, Vicente.
All good, Mike Wise. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you again for joining us today as we launch the 8th edition of our grid, our global report on internal displacement this year, with a focus on food security. As Alexandra just mentioned, the reason why we wanted to look at this topic more in depth is because as our team was monitoring the situation of internal displacement last year, we observed that many countries experiencing internal displacement were also facing rising food insecurity. So we therefore wanted to explore how these two phenomena overlap, what is their relationship, and also what can be done to find solutions to their overlapping and compounding impacts. So what I'm about to present to you today is just an overview of the report's main findings, but there is much more information available in the main report and also on its associated products that you will find online that I encourage everyone to explore. As Alexandra mentioned, internal displacement broke many records last year. An all-time high of 71.1 million internally displaced people, or IDPs, were reported last year. This is a 20% increase from the previous year, when figures were already the highest ever reported. The war in Ukraine, but also widespread disasters in several regions across the world, explain this rising trend. These newly displaced joined the tens of millions of IDPs already living in protracted displacement as a result of previous conflicts, repeated disasters, and the lack of durable solutions. If we break down this figure by type of trigger, we see that out of the 71.1 million, 62.5 million were displaced by conflict and violence across 65 countries and territories globally. This figure is a 17% increase compared to 2021. Once again, the war in Ukraine explains such increase, as the total number of IDPs increased by almost 5 million compared to the previous year. But ongoing conflict and violence in other countries such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Somalia also contributing to this rising figure. In countries home to large internally displaced populations such as Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan, the number of new instances of displacement actually decreased last year. However, the total number of IDPs by conflict and violence continued to rise. This reveals the protracted situation that many conflict IDPs are currently experiencing. Looking at disasters, what will first jump to the eye is the difference in the geographical footprint of this phenomenon, but also that the figure compared to conflict is way lower. Several issues explain this. From on the one hand, it's a methodological issue, but on the other is that we are still confronted with significant gaps when it comes to understanding the duration of disaster displacement. Many reports following disasters end up soon after the bigger impacts recede, leaving huge gaps. However, this 8.7 million figure represents a 45% increase compared to the year before, with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria recording the highest figures. But it is important to remind too that in many countries, although we are presenting these figures separately, in many countries, They are actually overlapping. This photo is was taken in South Sudan last year, a country that has been regularly affected by conflict and violence, but also by disasters, especially floods. And the compounding impacts of both crises are or keep increasing the humanitarian needs of IDPs. So we cannot forget also how these situations are overlapping. And there are also other cases around the globe, for example, including Yemen, where people tried to return, but there were landmines, and these landmines got then moved by the floods last year, hampering people to return. And that's why also, despite the lull in violence, people have not found yet a lasting solution. Now, what I presented before was this end-of-year snapshot that you saw in the explainer video. What I'm about to present in the following slides is the number of movements, or internal displacements, or movements of people. So we refer to this as the number of internal displacements, as was also explained in the video, which last year reached another breaking figure of 60.9 million internal displacements, a 60% increase from the previous year. Let's now unpack what explains this increase. In terms of disasters displacement, figures were 41% higher than the annual average of the past 10 years, totaling 32.6 million, also the highest ever recorded. 1/4 of this figure were triggered during the Pakistan floods, which at its peak left 10% of the country underwater. In addition, the Horn of Africa region was hit by the most severe drought in 40 years, which triggered 2.1 million displacements across Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Another significant event were the Nigeria floods that triggered the highest number of displacements in the country in a decade, totaling 2.4 million. But it is also important to underscore that beyond these major or large-scale events, there were significant smaller and medium-scale events that, when aggregated, also contributed to this rising figure. In terms of conflict and violence, there were 28.3 million internal displacements, the highest figure we've ever recorded, and more than 3 times higher than the annual average of the past 10 years. I think that the chart talks by itself. 60% of this figure refers to Ukraine alone. Shelling and airstrikes hit major towns and cities, including the capital, Kiev. Civilians sought safety underground, and cars jammed highways, while trains evacuated hundreds of thousands of people from affected areas. Internal displacement was a survival strategy for many Ukrainians throughout the year as a result of attacks, damage to critical infrastructure, and the lack of access to basic services. But other countries, such as the DRC, reported also very high figures. In the DRC alone, 4 million displacements was the figure, a near 50% increase from the previous year, and most of these displacements took place in the eastern provinces of Ituri, North Kivu, and South Kivu. But here again, also important to underscore that beyond these major crises or larger countries, smaller countries, including Haiti and Papua New Guinea, also reported their highest figures. Now, the report also breaks down the analysis by region and provides regional overviews and specific country spotlights. Due to time constraints, I'm going to only go over quickly the main findings for each region. But it's interesting because there were a lot of shifting dynamics last year at the regional level too. One of the most striking is Europe and Central Asia. This is a region that has recorded historically the lowest figures. And last year, the trend was opposite. It was the region recording the highest figures due to the conflict in Ukraine. Followed by Sub-Saharan Africa. In the region, taken together, conflict and disasters, the number of displacements were the highest ever recorded. But this is almost mostly explained by a near threefold increase in the number of disaster displacements to 7.4 million. So I already mentioned the Horn of Africa drought and also the Nigeria floods, but many countries, including Ethiopia, Madagascar, Mauritania, and South Sudan, to mention just a few, reported their highest figures. In terms of conflict and violence, there was a slight decrease. However, the number remained concerningly high at 9 million displacements in 20 countries, many of which are undergoing protracted displacement situations. Another shift was South Asia, that for the first time in more than a decade surpassed East Asia and the Pacific in terms of disaster displacement. The outlier event of the Pakistan floods explained this. But another interesting finding from last year in South Asia is that the number of conflict displacements reduced by 95%. This is the result of a significant reduction in fighting and new displacement in Afghanistan. But here again, it is a country that despite that there was a significant reduction in new displacement, the actual number of conflict IDPs continued to rise at 4.4 million. So if we were to add disaster IDPs in the country, it would total 6.6 million, the second highest globally after Syria. East Asia and Pacific saw also shifts in the sense that the La Niña phenomenon led to less intense rainy and cyclone seasons, and the figures were lower than the decade average. However, they remained very high at more than 10 million. In terms of conflict displacement, it increased, mostly the result of escalating conflict in Myanmar. In the Americas, disaster displacement also increased, and figures were, especially due to floods, were the highest in countries such as Brazil and Colombia. But here again, although we did record some large events in both countries, small-scale, localized events of displacement also added to this record-breaking figure. Wildfire-related displacement was also the highest in the Americas region, and this mirrors previous years, mostly in the US, especially the states of California, Tennessee, and New Mexico reported high figures. In terms of conflict and violence, in this region, the number of displacements increased, mostly because of an increase in displacement in Colombia and Haiti. However, there are also methodological considerations here because there's more data availability for Colombia, for instance, and in Haiti, better coverage as well. And to end, the Middle East and North Africa region continued at the trend of a reduction in new instances of displacement basically persisted from a third consecutive year. Less new displacement by conflict and violence, but here again, same as Afghanistan, the number of IDPs continued to rise. So really, and as I explained in the Yemen case, many of these countries also were confronted to the compounding impacts of both conflict and disasters. And all of this explains this record high figure. Now, moving on to the topic of this year's grid on food security. As I said before, entrenched conflict, disasters and displacement aggravated global food insecurity, which was already a concern as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and its slow and uneven recovery in many countries. Low-income countries in particular, many of which are dealing with internal displacement, were most affected, in part given their reliance on food and fertilizer imports and international humanitarian aid. And the war in Ukraine brought another challenge to this situation, or another layer of complexity to this situation, being Ukraine and Russia some of the main exporters of grain and fertilizer globally, which had cascading impacts on countries affected by internal displacement, including Yemen, Somalia, and Ethiopia, to mention just a few. So we wanted to unpack what is this relationship. So to be clear and transparent, what I'm about to show, the data that I'm about to discuss, differs slightly from the one that was put forward last week in the Global Report on Food Crisis, basically because of differences in cutoff dates, methodologies, and coverage. We have a methodological note explaining such differences, but what this map reveals is that indeed many, like internal displacement and food security or food insecurity, are indeed overlapping in many countries. So what you see shaded in color are the number of people, is the share of population assessed as facing crisis level of food insecurity or worse, based on the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or IPC, which is one of the most well-known measurements of food insecurity. In this analysis, we covered 49 countries with IPC data. And what you can see in proportional circles is the number of IDPs by both conflict and disasters. As can be seen again, both values overlap. 3/4 of the countries with food insecurity data was available had internally displaced populations. However, there are important gaps in the disaggregation of this data. We know the share of population, but we don't know out of these how many are IDPs. Such data is only available in 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Somalia, and Kenya. And also what this map reveals is a significant gap because countries with a high number of IDPs, including Colombia, Ukraine, and Syria, do not have IPC data or food security data as per IPC. And this means that across several countries, it is likely that many IDPs are experiencing food insecurity, but their needs are not identified. But I wanted to share with you what can be done when data is indeed available. Zooming in the example of Burkina Faso. What you see in the chart above is a combination of 3 different metrics. First, the number of conflict incidents involving at least 1 fatality, which is what you see in lighter orange in the back. Second, the number of acutely food insecure people, which is what you see in red bars. And third, the number of conflict IDPs, which is what you see in the orange line. As you can see, the 3 values have grown almost in parallel since 2018, showing a clear correlation. And when we dig deeper into the data from last year, which is what you see in the map below, you can see that the regions that had the highest share of population facing acute food insecurity are also home to the majority of the internally displaced populations. And this data also differentiates between IDPs and their hosts. I'm not entering, unfortunately, into the details, but there's an entire spotlight and paper about this. But this really shows the value of data in really not only revealing this reality, but also informing operations and policies. I am particularly thankful not only to IDMC's research team, who helped us unveiling other dimensions of this relationship, but also to our partners that Alexandra mentioned before, who also contributed via background papers to this report. So the findings that I'm showing also are the result of this collaboration. And we also wanted to unpack the social and economic impact of displacement and food insecurity. So evidence from several countries, including Cameroon, Colombia, Mali, and Niger, among others, suggest that conditions are often worse for IDPs who tend to lower their food intake as a result of their displacement. Also, that food insecurity tends to get worse the more often they are displaced. So here again, the relevance of monitoring repeated displacement and understanding how this impacts IDPs' vulnerability and food security. And also, we discuss in this report with examples from around the world into which extent internally displaced children also tend to face higher levels of malnutrition than their non-displaced peers, how female IDPs tend to be more food insecure than their male counterparts, which is reflective of how gender norms play a role in women's access to food and livelihoods before and during displacement, how older IDPs may be left out of nutritional support and food distribution programs. We tried as much as we could to unpack how internal displacement is affecting non-displaced communities, including host communities. But here we were confronted with another significant gap. So another research question that is popping up as part of this analysis. So understanding the specific vulnerabilities of different groups of IDPs face by collecting more inclusive and disaggregated data and using it to inform tailored programming is key to preventing and responding to the compounding impacts of food security and displacement. So, but the picture that I've shown or discussed so far is rather grim. But in this report, we also wanted to discuss what solutions are at hand that can help addressing both food security and internal displacement crisis. We provided 3 main recommendations with concrete examples from around the world. The first one is that we need to support IDPs via cash assistance and social protection. The second one, to support their livelihoods and skills development for their self-reliance. And third, the urgent need to fill the data gaps. Quickly unpacking the first recommendation, stakeholders working on food security have increasingly taken anticipatory action, successfully shifting the paradigm from emergency aid to providing other forms of assistance, including cash, to build resilience, which is a vital means of supporting the immediate needs of people affected by displacement and food insecurity. It is particularly useful for IDPs, given that their needs and priorities change as a result of leaving their homes and livelihood behind. But these cash assistance measures are, of course, short term. So they need to be bridged with longer-term social protection schemes led by governments and their development partners. We have concrete examples, for example, in Colombia, where such initiatives are being taken forward. Moving on to the second one, support livelihoods and skills development for IDPs' self-reliance. The findings here reveal basically that we should not only focus on the needs of IDPs, as this tends to eclipse their capacity to overcome them, diminishing their role in achieving durable solutions and longer-term development. So we need to shift such approach, and this is all the more relevant in countries affected by both food insecurity, and displacement. It is, as Alexandra also said, important to leverage their role as farmers, laborers, vendors, consumers, and entrepreneurs, and their potential to contribute to rebuilding and maintaining food systems and positively shaping food security outcomes. And last but not least, I already unpacked some of the data gaps, but we are also making a call to action on how to fill them. As I showed, many food security assessments do not disaggregate data by displacement status. This limits our understanding of how IDPs may be unevenly affected by food insecurity. There is an overall lack of disaggregated and longitudinal data, which also limits our understanding of how displacement affects broader food systems. In general, methodologies, indicators, geographical coverage, and reporting timeframes also differ. And we are also not only making a call to action to fill these gaps, but also showing examples of many partners who are already on it. And basically, all of this is to say that we need to ensure the inclusion of millions of IDPs who may be suffering disproportionately from food insecurity, and their needs and their aspirations should also be considered a priority. So with that, I'm finishing my presentation, not without letting you all know that in addition to launching the report, we're also launching a new version of our global internal displacement database that I am encouraging everyone to explore, because you can run your own queries and do your own trends analysis. And of course, our team remains available for any questions you may have. So thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Vicente, for this excellent presentation. And just to rectify my slip-up from earlier, let me confirm that Vicente Anzelina is IDMC's Global and Regional Analysis Manager. He is the coordinator of IDMC's global report, but he's also one of its lead authors. Thank you so much for your presentation. I would like now to welcome our speakers to the chairs here. And while you seat yourselves, I will gradually introduce you, so please come and join me. Please. Just here, Mr. Abdishakur, please. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, well, welcome to this launch. I'm very pleased to introduce our esteemed speakers. Just before we do so, we are going to have a discussion. So I'd just like to inform our online audience that there is a possibility to access a Q&A and to send some questions to my team who is behind the scenes collecting those questions. So now moving to our panelists, I'm very, very pleased to introduce you first to Mr. Abdirahman Abdishakur, who is the Special Presidential Envoy for Humanitarian and Drought Response of the Federal Government of Somalia. Mr. Abdishakur was appointed to this role in May 2022, and he's also an elected member of the Somali Federal Parliament since February 2022. Prior to that, Mr. Abdishakur contributed to the peace and state formation process in Somalia and occupied different roles, including Somalia's Minister for Planning and International Cooperation, a Senior Policy Advisor to the President of the Federal Republic, and Special Advisor to the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Somalia. Your Excellency, it's an honor to have you with us today. Next, I would like to introduce Ms. Evelien van Romberg. I hope my Dutch is good enough to have said that right. Evelien is Programs and Influencing Director for Oxfam in Africa. She leads Oxfam's humanitarian action programs influencing funding, advocacy and campaigns across the Africa continent. Since joining Oxfam in 2016, she's headed Oxfam's Office for Advocacy and Engagement in Brussels, has been Deputy Director of Campaigns and Advocacy and Oxfam's Europe Migration Campaign Manager. Welcome, Evelien. Very nice to have you with us. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Rein Paulsen, Director of the Office for Emergencies and Resilience at the Food and Agriculture Organization. As I said earlier, FAO has been a key contributor to this year's grid, so thank you very much for representing FAO today. Before joining FAO in 2021, Mr. Paulsen occupied different positions in OCHA, in Panama, DRC, and here in Geneva. And prior to working for the UN, Mr. Paulsen had an extensive experience on food security and humanitarian issues in the NGO sector in the USA, Haiti, South Africa, and Geneva. Pleasure to have you with us today. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to welcome Ms. Wilhelmina Welsh, Coordinator of the Joint IDP Profiling Service, JIPS, a sister agency to IDMC here in Geneva. Wilhelmina has worked as analyst and assessment expert in the humanitarian and development field for over a decade and has worked with FAO, OCHA, OHCHR, UNDP, and NRC. And briefly IDMC as well. She currently heads the Joint IDP Profiling Service. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, Wilhelmina. Great to have you with us. So thank you all for being here. And without further ado, I'd like to kick off this discussion with a spotlight on Somalia. We're, I think, all aware of the severe drought that Somalia has been experiencing these last few years. And as we were saying earlier, also more recently, a lot of flooding across the country. So Mr. Abdi Shakur, clearly, these disasters have aggravated food insecurity as well as internal displacement across Somalia. So could you please start by giving us an overview of what this multifaceted crisis looks like right now in your country, and then walk us a little bit through the steps that your government has taken to mitigate the impacts of both internal displacement and food insecurity recently and over the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and I really appreciate and recognize you report the extent of information that contained by the report, and it is vital for shaping policies, strategies, and programs for policymakers and decision makers. And coming back to Somalia, Somalia is one of the countries which was included in the report and faces multiple of food insecurity challenges, including conflict and climate-driven crisis. When I was appointed last year, May last year, my main task was to mobilize and advocate for resources to prevent famine in the country. And almost closer to 7.8 million of Somalis were facing acute of food insecurity, and 1 million of them was displaced by their places. And also, one of the 4 million of that 7.8 million were children under 5 years. But today, after 1 year, luckily we prevented the famine with the leadership of federal government of Somalia, with the support of the donor community, particularly United States, which contributed the largest of humanitarian assistance, and with the effective work of UN and international NGOs and local NGOs on the ground, we luckily prevented the famine. after 1 year, we are facing floods. My country today is facing another extreme and climate caused disaster, which is a flood. So we are in between flood and drought. And the causes is clear. It is a climate change, which Somalia has nothing to do with when it comes into the contribution of the climate change. We are facing the dire consequence of the climate change, but we are not contributors of the climate change. And here we need to have a discussion how we can have it used to be a nexus between humanitarian peace and development. We need another new nexus of the internal displacement, food insecurity, and the climate change. And that's real, and it's happening in my country. And we 45% of Somali people are urbanized. We have, as indicated in the report, we have closer to 3.9 million internally displaced people who don't want to go back to traditional livelihoods. And the cities and urbanism in Somalia cannot afford to host that community. So we need here to focus more and address the root cause of the problems rather than dealing with the symptoms of a humanitarian response or emergencies. That's why I added my voice to every panel and every platform, international arena, is that we need to focus the root cause of the problem, not the symptoms, which mainly all the people pay attention to it, which is a humanitarian response. How we can continue to having that. Yes, there is a multiple challenges and causes for the internal displacement. And usually it's very extremely difficult how you balance between the urgency and importance. How you balance between competing demands and conflicting priorities. It's always a challenge for the decision makers, people. But the Somali government really are trying to address that issues. Couple of actions, including enacting policies and programs for that, and the durable solution initiatives that has paved the way to the integration of the mainstreaming the durable solution in relevant chapter of our national development plan. We have also Somali, and we adopted also national reconciliation framework to consolidate the regional and national leadership in participatory way, and to provide coordination platform for peace building effort in the country. And also we enacted and developed policies and strategy relating to climate change policy, environmental management policy, national water management policy and energy policy, national disaster management policy, agricultural policy, livestock. We put in place the policies together and frameworks, but what we lack really is critical investment regarding to the infrastructural and investments, whether it is an agricultural infrastructure, whether it is an economic infrastructure or development infrastructure. We need to have more now on focusing on investment in infrastructure. Yes, we also need to how we can combine emergencies response with long-term solutions in sustainable food system and climate adaptation. That's another key issue. Collaboration with the national government. How those who are working in the field, whether it's humanitarian agencies or other critical partners, can work with the national government to create and develop a strategic financing partnership to avoid the gaps. And institutionalization and operationalization partnership through capacity building, knowledge sharing, and monitoring and evaluation system. It's also critical. I think I want to stop here and let the audience to have their questions. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdi Shakur. You've said a lot of things, and I think it just confirms how Somalia, in a sense, is sadly a perfect example of many of the issues that have been highlighted in the reports. You've mentioned the interconnection between so many different drivers of displacement in the country, the coming together of drought, floods, climate impacts, and the need to really look at this as a nexus issue. And one point in particular that may come back later is this idea of the impossibility of return more and more that we're seeing across so many other countries, where these areas are becoming so uninhabitable that return is no longer an option, and we need to rethink really what durable solutions mean for displaced people in those contexts. You've also touched on the need for integrated planning for the coming together also of the relevant sort of policy frameworks more on the normative side. So great to hear, for example, that the Durable Solutions Initiative is integrated into Somalia's National Development Plan, and that this is coming together with a reconciliation framework and with other climate change and disaster risk reduction strategies. So again, one of the key, I think, recommendations also from our report. We may come back to the financing piece, because you mentioned that, yes, famine has been averted thanks to the influx of humanitarian funding and assistance from, the efforts from your government itself, but also from its international partners like the United States. But what about the longer-term development investments that are going to be so critical to building up the right kind of infrastructure, whether it's in the agricultural sector or economic development more generally? So maybe we'll come back to that. So thank you very much for this initial overview. Looking to you, Evelyn, and building on this example, perhaps you could also tell us, since Oxfam is operating in 70 countries, including many that host large populations of IDPs, and where you've no doubt also seen various climatic impacts, but also food insecurity issues coming up there. So could you please tell us about some of the impacts that you've seen on different IDP groups and on Oxfam's experience in addressing these overlapping effects? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and congratulations on this excellent report that sheds such a great light on, an important light on the interplay between food insecurity and displacement. Really, really well done. Mr. Angelini already talked about Burkina Faso in his introduction, and I want to speak shortly about Ramato Sanfo. He's a herder in North Burkina Faso, and imagine his desperation when he saw the rains becoming less and less after years, knowing what this meant for the food that was needed for his cattle. And he told my colleagues that with no opportunity to graze, his sheep became thinner and thinner, and he had to sell them in the end at a loss, which also meant that he had to pull his kids out of school, and then he became displaced with his family, like so many others, as has been rightly pointed out in the report. In the east of Africa, in the Horn, in the Great Lakes region, close to 20 million people are displaced due to violence, due to droughts, due to flooding. And the region is really suffering from the worst drought in 4 decades, with 6 consecutive failed rain seasons. And large-scale flooding in South Sudan, on the other hand, has devastated, destroyed, and displaced communities. In the Sahel, we see communities abandoning agricultural land due to conflicts, pockets of droughts, and flooding. And as many as 5 million people who are currently displaced in the region live with host communities who are also facing difficult conditions and have scarce resources, which is then again leading to tension and potentially conflict. We see coping mechanisms similar to Mr. Sanfo, like selling animals, opting out of health services, opting out of school, eating seeds, and indeed becoming displaced. And in these countries, Oxfam supports particularly the vulnerable households, IDPs and host communities, to increase their resilience and to improve their food security. And we do this by distributing seeds, by distributing tools, making cash transfers. That was also something that was mentioned to stimulate what is left from local markets. We support in crop production, in improving farming practices, and establishing much needed early warning systems. And we also work hard on rehabilitation of water points, because food scarcity and water, or the lack thereof, is really closely interlinked. I was really happy to hear the contribution from Ambassador Smith to talk about gender, because this joint crisis of food insecurity and displacement has a disproportionate effect on women and girls. In the Sahel, for example, we see that as food becomes scarcer and conflicts continue and people get displaced, more and more girls are forced into early marriage or are victims of other types of gender-based violence. Girls are also the first who are taken out of schools. So women and girls should really be at the forefront of any of these responses to counter these negative coping mechanisms, but also because women play multiple roles in food security. They're food producers, they're farmers, they're traders, they're natural resource managers and food processors, and they often take the responsibility for households, food preparation and consumption, as well as water supplies. And this continues when they get displaced. So having women and girls at the heart of the response is crucial. Climate has already been mentioned, but it really needs to be at the top of our minds. It's a huge driver of both food insecurity and displacement. And the GRID report indeed highlights that half of the people displaced last year were forced to do so because of weather-induced disasters. And all of these disasters only continue to increase while we fail to address the climate crisis. And we also see that farmers and pastoralists have to leave their agricultural lands behind because they're not longer able to farm due to droughts and due to floods. So obviously this also has an impact on food security. And the envoy from Somalia already mentioned this, that this is really also the case in his country. So climate crisis is impacting and increasing food insecurity and displacement, which in turn is increasing food security. So there's an extremely unjust element to this, and that was also already mentioned, and that's that often the populations that are least responsible for historic greenhouse gas emissions are the ones that are suffering the most from the consequences of it, both in terms of displacement and in terms of food insecurity. So what is needed is for rich countries to reduce their emissions, obviously, but also to mobilize funds, the funds that has been promised for years for low-income countries to cope with the climate and other crises. On the other hand, if funds remain unpredictable, insufficient, and late as every year, these regions will be trapped in a deadly cycle of hunger and displacement. And lastly, a major cause of food insecurity and there's also displacement is our failing global food system. Contrary to what you may believe when we talk about hunger and growing hunger in the world, there is enough food to feed everyone, but it's often unaffordable or unattainable because food is often used for other purposes like biofuels or animal feed. And millions of people are struggling to put food on the table, but not everyone is losing out. We saw last year that food traders like Cargill and ADM made record profits, and billionaires in the food and agriculture business saw their collective wealth increase by $382 billion in the last 3 years, which is enough to fund all the UN humanitarian appeals 10 times over. And this huge inequality in the system really needs to be addressed. Most people in low-income countries depend on agriculture to survive, to feed themselves, to feed their communities. So the answer to tackling food insecurity, as well as the vulnerabilities that come with displacement, lies in more support to farmers and agricultural workers in these countries. It's really essential that small-scale farmers have access to infrastructure, to markets, to funding, and that their land rights are protected. So a shift in the global food system is key, one that's local, that's sustainable, and that contributes to climate resilience. It will help to prevent people from becoming displaced. But when they get displaced nonetheless, these local and sustainable agricultural and food systems will increase their resilience and ability to deal with shocks, both for displaced people and for their communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Evelyn. There's so much there that I think we could reflect on. Don't really know where to start, but maybe let me just kind of pick on a couple of things that you've said that I think are worth taking forward in the conversation. One is on what you mentioned about the coping mechanisms that we're seeing and that are not specific to one country. These are common strategies at play, opting out of health systems, opting out of schools. I think it's also interesting to look at that link to wider education cycles in children and how this over the long term is going to affect children and future generations. The gender dimension, absolutely. There's probably a need to understand more how different gender dynamics play out in these contexts, but more importantly, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts perhaps in the second round on how we can really put women at the center of the response. What does that actually mean in practice? If you could give a few examples of where that's happened effectively. And then, of course, the third point that you've made, which I think is crucial, is it's a much more, in a sense, almost an existential question. I'm not sure we'll get to the bottom of it today, but the huge inequality within the system and the fact that actually the global food crisis is more of a crisis of poverty and access more than food itself. And again, what can be done about that and how effective has Oxfam International's advocacy work been in trying to rectify some of these inequalities? It would be great to if you could share that in the next round. Moving to Mr. Paulsen, well, FAO has a long history of working with IDPs and their host communities, and in FAO's submission to the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement, FAO highlighted two very important dimensions. First, it was on the importance, as our two previous speakers have said, of strengthening the resilience and the self-resilience of communities to prevent and to resolve internal displacement. And secondly, you also highlighted the need for more data to better understand the relationship between internal displacement and food security. And I think one of the points that FAO was making was, for now at least, the fact that IDPs are not sufficiently reflected across data collection on food security. So can you share with us some concrete examples of how FAO does include IDPs and their host communities in its activities and policies to build resilient food systems? And what are, as you see them, some of the remaining data gaps?
With pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alexandra. And let me add my voice to the congratulations to IDMC for this excellent report. It's hard to believe it's been 25 years since 1998, but incredible work all of these years. And indeed, this year in particular, FAO was very pleased to contribute along with other partners to this important topic. But congratulations again. And congratulations because I think this report is highlighting some incredibly important findings, not just the numbers, but also drawing some of the conclusions and the recommendations that comes out of it. And indeed, in the summary that was so clearly presented on the main findings of the report, and as you stated in your question, FAO indeed feels very strongly about the need to support and to strengthen the self-reliance, resilience of IDPs, both through all their stages of displacement, including, of course, when they return, if they're able to return to home communities. And this attention to resilience, this attention to livelihoods, we see as absolutely indispensable to any meaningful discussion around durable solutions. I'll take a step away from the notes that have been very helpfully prepared for me here, just to say reference was made to the Global Report on Food Crisis that was launched last week. And for those that had a chance to see it, you'll see that the overwhelming majority of people that live in acute food insecurity in IPC phases 3, 4, and 5 are people that live in rural communities and are attached to agriculture for their livelihoods. And so unsurprisingly, when we look at issues of internal displacement, we also see this correlation between agriculture as a primary means of livelihoods and how people were able to sustain themselves and their families before displacement. And I do think, I mean, you said something really, you made a number of really important comments. One of the things that stuck in my head, Alexandra, was this comment about behind the numbers of people. And I think a reminder, which I know we all know, but we do need to keep reminding ourselves, is before someone was forced to flee, before someone became an IDP, they were a farmer, a fisher, a herder, right? They have agency, they have backgrounds, they have skill sets, and it's vital that we build on this as we're looking both for the most effective, dignified, appropriate ways to support in the immediate sense, but also, as I said, when it comes to long-term solutions. So, unsurprisingly, with those comments in mind, FAO, of course, feels then strongly that a critical role of early investment in livelihoods and agriculture can and does play an important role in addressing and preventing acute food insecurity. And I think, importantly, in avoiding the risk of falling into longer-term dependency, again, I was struck by those numbers about the length and the duration of internal displacement, right? So it's imperative that we get the type of support right to make sure that we're doing less harm in that regard. You asked the question around what we're doing in different contexts. Let me just refer to, well, I could refer to any number of countries, but just Iraq as an example. After years of conflict, as you would expect, the agricultural sector in Iraq has suffered massive damage to infrastructure, damage and loss of farm assets. And many of those who were displaced saw their agricultural livelihoods then destroyed. And they've been suffering then also as a result, unsurprisingly, of persistent food insecurity. We're seeing now opportunities, encouragingly, of possibility to return to home villages. But again, evidence is telling us, and this is true in Iraq, it's true in many other countries, that returning to their communities, IDPs can be particularly vulnerable to food insecurity, precisely given that loss of productive assets, the loss of sources of income that happen as a result of both the destruction of the assets and the prolonged displacement that they've been in. So in the face of these challenges, there are things that can be done, and it's important also to focus on good practice and success stories. So in Iraq, FAO is working in the governorates with the highest returnee populations to facilitate sustainable reintegration of IDPs into rural areas. And we take a comprehensive approach to this. It's focused, unsurprisingly, on rebuilding agricultural livelihoods and using that as a way of strengthening food security and nutrition. What's key for us as FAO is that we are not approaching this from a sort of a siloed perspective where certain activities are understood as relevant because they're humanitarian, or other activities need to happen at a point in time because they're classified as development. We're really being guided by evidence. We're being guided by what displaced populations, returnee populations themselves are asking for. And so we have a combination of activities. There is some short-term input support, agricultural inputs, but those are combined straight away with longer-term activities, whether that's technical training on agricultural practices and techniques, or using community-led food system strengthening approaches. We look at strengthening, rebuilding, rehabilitating infrastructure, water infrastructure, not least, that's required for cropping and for support of support of animals and livestock. So there are many different components here, but just to say this message around needing to be informed in the first instance by the context that people find themselves in, what they themselves are articulating as requirements, and working back from that rather than some type of arbitrary classification of which activities make sense at which point in time, according to our definitions of what is humanitarian and what is development, is absolutely indispensable to making a difference. So FAO's approach is a comprehensive one to food system and agricultural livelihood strengthening. I could talk about this for a long time, as you can imagine. Let me move on in the interest of time, Alexandra, to your second question. You asked about data gaps. And let me focus on two issues. And the first of those I've sort of already touched on, and they're both interrelated. And these are gaps that refer to information that's largely missing from our current programmatic and policy responses to food insecurity amongst displaced populations. And importantly, when we're looking for solutions to internal displacement. The first flows from our collective failure as humanitarian and development actors to systematically embed approaches to data collection which truly seek to listen to IDPs, to understand, and most importantly, to act, to adapt our approaches and our programming. Many, if not all of us in the room, I'm sure, have been engaged in different discussions around how we can emphasize even more listening to populations. Often the term accountability to affected populations is used, and often what's proposed as an answer is more listening mechanisms that need to be put in place. But I was struck earlier this year when Ground Truth Solutions released a summary of 10 years of findings around what people in many different geographies around the world are articulating in terms of their needs, right? So the issue perhaps is less listening and more on the acting piece. And when you look at the summary of what, if I just follow through on the Ground Truth solutions piece, when you look at what is being asked for, there are common themes that come through. And livelihoods, a means to look after oneself, is a recurrent theme. I mean, completely unsurprisingly, who of us would not want an ability to look after ourselves and look after those we care about in a disaster situation? So again, how we can emphasize these issues is key. The second critical piece relates to current global food security monitoring systems. And again, I'm really pleased that this came out as a key finding in the report. You know, the paucity of disaggregated data, the fact that we're largely blind in terms of the food security needs of IDP populations specifically, I think is really important. And where we do have information, it's reminding us why we need to redouble our efforts to get more. I was looking in a very different context this morning about pre-existing data from Sudan, which talked about, I mean, this is one of the instances where we had some data before, that 64% of the IDP population was food insecure that was surveyed in Sudan versus 31% of the host populations. And by the way, host populations that themselves have no shortage of vulnerabilities and needs were food insecure. So again, where we have fragments of information, it's telling us that we need a lot more. So this call to have much more consistent data on the food security situation of IDPs is absolutely a priority, and we look forward to continuing to collaborating on those pieces. Again, without that adequate data, of course, it's not possible to design the types of context-specific, family-specific, community-specific interventions that are required to make a difference. So, put simply, if we are to fully understand the gravity, nature, impacts of food insecurity on IDPs, we have to adapt our food security monitoring systems to the contextual realities of displaced people themselves, systematically disaggregating the data by status in our analysis, and use that for our programming and also, importantly, obviously, for our advocacy. Thank you very much, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Rein. Well, I'm sure that Wilhelmina will pick up on many of the points that you've made regarding data, but it's also great to hear, I think, clearly, I mean, FAO epitomizes the longer-term approaches that we need to take when looking at these issues, and the need to both bridge, to work on the early anticipatory actions, so by building more resilient systems in the first place, and then investing in longer-term agricultural production, including, and I think the example that you gave of in Iraq is very interesting, including to facilitate then a sustainable return of people when they do have the opportunity to return. So I may come back to you on that, and if we have time for a second round. But also, it would be great to hear a little bit more. I think we're all very sensitive to the idea of putting IDPs at the center and being better at listening to their needs and incorporating those kinds of approaches into data collection itself. So. Moving to Wilhelmina, thank you, Rain. You've heard now from the other speakers of some of the challenges and the policy priorities that are linked to displacement and food insecurity, and a reflection just now on the need to get better at including IDPs in food security related data collection efforts. What are your thoughts on this? I assume that you agree with Rain, but do we currently, according to you, have the right kind of data and insights to inform action, including anticipatory action? And what do you see as some of the key data priorities moving forward? And what are some of the lessons that we could learn from GIPS and its partners that could be relevant to inform these efforts in the future?
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And I'm, just to join and of course, congratulate you on this fantastic report, which I think does something really important. It shows that the numbers and the scale is key as a starting point, but in order to understand these complex processes, we need more. And I think it's also what the panel is showing. And I'm hoping that amid the staggering figures we're hearing, the question is coming up in terms of, and what can we do then? How are we going to address finding solutions at scale? And what information do we need in order to do that? And I hope that I'm coming, bearing also some good news and some progress actually happening also on the data side that I think is good to highlight. Maybe just to also go back and highlight from, linkage to some of the experience FAO is also sharing on programming in forced displacement situations, putting it really eloquently in terms of emphasizing the need to act on multiple fronts simultaneously to achieve durable solutions. And I think that what we heard today in the panel basically highlights a few of the elements that we as an interagency technical service are here to support, because we know that collecting data in situations of internal displacement is challenging. This is also why we do still have gaps. It comes with specific requirements. And especially in order to understand what it takes to overcome displacement-related vulnerabilities, we need more than just, we need more than just a scale. We need to actually, in order to implement those approaches, listening to populations. I'll highlight three things that are really important. Of course, quality data, which means robust data linked to national systems. It is a mixed approach mixed approaches, qualitative and quantitative data that gives us both the scope and the scale of those situations, and a comparative approach, because as you just mentioned, the survey in Sudan and in many other places, we are not able to understand what are key displacement-related vulnerabilities if we do not compare those populations to populations that are not displaced. And we know, for example, in Darfur that both displaced and non-displaced populations live under the extreme poverty line. So what are the obstacles that actually IDPs face? So here we need to actually drop down in that level and really apply these comparative approaches. And the availability of the right kind of data also for anticipatory action. I really like to quote the Gallup Institute very often, because they said recently that the best way to predict and understand people's behavior and intentions is to ask them. And we will need to tackle that more seriously. these listening approaches, including communities, that requires rigor in order to be really included. And maybe just to highlight that there is a push in the community, as we are such and supporting data processes, to look at collective intelligence approaches. I know that the GIPS and IOM team just came back from Burundi, where there is a pilot exploring the linkage of climate-related displacement and really building a process from the beginning based on collective intelligence, meaning really putting IDPs at the center, not as the subjects of these exercises, but as the ones using this information, as the ones who will formulate what solutions look like for them. Maybe just to also depart from my notes, but just to go back to Sudan, one of the durable solutions analysis processes conducted there included nomad families. And they told us that it's the first time that they're actually being specifically invited and included to share their views and their challenges in such a study. And we had the opportunity for all of those populations and subgroups, those who have not been displaced, nomad families, those who are returning, to express what would their communities look like if they had overcome the challenges linked to their displacement. And I think that requires also analytical rigor, methodological rigor to design those approaches. Maybe the second point that I find, and here I'm really honored and very pleased to be also joined by the special envoy, because I think the other step, maybe some of the good news, is that, of course, to address this scale, we also need data and understanding at scale. And we can only do that through supporting national systems that produce this data. And I think here, from the example of our joint work, we have achieved actually quite an important global milestone in 2020 with the endorsement of the international recommendations for IDP statistics. And I think maybe this is sort of where we need to make the linkages more strongly also with the humanitarian actors responding on that side. And we have here also happy to be representing the expert group on refugee IDP and statelessness statistics, EGRIS. We are making progress to implement those international recommendations and support national systems to disaggregate by forced displacement status. Maybe just an example actually from our joint work supporting the Somalia National Bureau of Statistics, who is championing this work, including the development of an IDP sectoral statistics plan that will become part of the national strategy on the development of statistics as one of the first countries. And I know that regionally there is great interest in Somalia's leadership on that. This statistical plan will allow the government and all partners to consistently, comparably, rigorously identify IDPs as part of the national system, and then be able to disaggregate all the national systems in major surveys by forced displacement status. We know that it's not going to be done tomorrow. The statistical plan has just been finalized in a draft, is being consulted with government counterparts, but we'll have the linkage to the work that the Special Envoy mentioned on the Durable Solutions Initiative side. We'll have the linkage to the Ministry of Planning's own strategy on durable solutions and its monitoring framework. And I think that is really the way for us to work together to leverage and really do it at scale through the work, through the national systems. So while the official statistics may not always be able to meet all the needs, especially not all needs from the humanitarian sector potentially, it will give us high-quality baselines. And I think we will need to move in the coming years into supporting these national systems to produce those. And of course, the humanitarian sector's data needs are somewhat different, maybe also in terms of timing, etc. But the methodological rigor that comes from the official statistics side, the standardization of IDP identification questions and surveys is something that, of course, humanitarian development peace actors can use, and that will give us a key link that I think is missing, and that is comparability. So that is just to highlight that there is, of course, this process that we are involved in all together on the data side, as well as from the statistical perspective with national actors to leverage it. In terms of maybe some of the lessons learned very briefly, maybe three key lessons, and wrapping up and sort of linking to what we began discussing. First, the importance of building strong partnerships with governments and national statistical offices cannot be overstated. Collaboration with national stakeholders is vital for data ownership, for political will, of course, and for having these tools to drive forward this agenda. It comes, of course, with those requirements, as we mentioned already, in terms of capacity building, the integration of IDP data into national development planning processes. We know that, of course, it also comes with the fact that national statistical offices are not always the most resourced agencies, and that they need those resources in order to be able to produce this data at scale that we say we need at this point. The second lesson is really on the engaging affected communities component, and it's really essential for collecting accurate and context-specific data. Just to follow up on the last point that was mentioned in terms of context. I think that it's really the importance of not only focusing on the figures, but sort of the people and places have to come together. People, those who are displaced and non-displaced, have to be seen in the context in which they live. Maybe just a quick another example from Sudan, where we look at people's intentions to pursue solutions. And we see that regardless of the intention they have to return or to stay, what influences that intention really is insecurity. So really understanding the context in which populations live. And here the perspective and voices provide critical insights into the challenges they face and the aspirations as well, the solutions that they see for themselves. So participatory approaches in data collection can really help ensure that these voices and realities are reflected. The third lesson in terms of adapting national systems really is changing the way we're doing things. But it requires time. And I think, working with government counterparts, with complex challenges, it is really something that requires this whole of government approach. It requires for national statistical offices to build that interest, to build that knowledge, to build that buy-in from other government counterparts to be able to implement these changes. But we have a powerful tool at our hands with those recommendations that we can start to use and leverage. So in summary, moving forward, really, it's critical to invest in building national data systems capacity on internal displacement, supporting capacity development and fostering collaboration. We need that in order to implement those recommendations. And of course, through the expert group on refugee, IDP, and statelessness statistics, forthcoming standard IDP identification questions, we will have this tool to produce reliable and comparable information about IDPs, including their food security status. Maybe here to wrap up, I want to emphasize once more that it's essential to move beyond solely the need for more data and really focus on the right kind of data to be able to leverage these intricacies and complexities that the GRID report so well outlines. And that requires not just continuing with the status quo, but of course providing tailored support. Here, of course, GIPS is an interagency service providing that technical support to all stakeholders to implement and use those standards and those tools. And of course, to consider not just the data producers, but talking about how can we produce better and more data, but to highlight who are the data users and how can communities actually use these approaches, how can they be involved from the beginning. And we're doing that as we've just come back from Nigeria as well, where there has been a request for a data collection exercise, and we first met with communities to understand how they would like to be involved, what are some of the challenges that need to be taken into consideration. So happy to stop here and come back to some of those points.
Thank you, Wilhelmina. Thanks very much. Many important points that you've made on the need, I think, to build on the international standards that we have out there, to leverage national systems, and particularly national statistical systems when it comes to filling the data gaps, the focus on methodological rigor and on I think setting baselines as well. You made an important point. Why are these baselines so important? Because if we are to monitor progress towards all the kind of global policy targets, national development plans, etc., we need to have a solid baseline, and then we need mechanisms and systems in place to allow for that regular monitoring and temperature taking along the way. So thank you very much. I'd like to, we have a few minutes left for a quick second round, if I may. Mr. Abdi Shakur, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on what's been said, like especially on the data side. How does that resonate with you in your role as special envoy in Somalia? How critical is data for informing your work? And do you feel that is the missing link when you think about the gaps that you mentioned between anticipatory forms of action and longer-term investment in critical infrastructure and agricultural development. Is data really what is missing, or is there something else? We've talked about financing. What are your thoughts on the priority needs right now for your mandate to be a successful one?
I think data is very important, but I don't think it's not the one is missing. One is missing is a political will. For instance, Somalia has faced almost 30 different disasters caused by the climate change for the last 30 years, including floods and droughts. An international community spent the last 12 years almost $8 billion for humanitarian response. And IDPs are increasing, the drought are recurring, the flood are also recurring, and those who are in need are increasing. So the question is, what went wrong? And everybody says that $1 spent in resilience saves for $5 spent in humanitarian response. Everybody agree with that. Donor community, agencies, implementing agencies, the national governments, everybody agrees that. But I don't think so. That what's missing isn't the data, it's a political will. It is those who are making the decisions to change their mind, and we need here to critically examine our humanitarian assistance to the countries like Somalia. And it has to come from the donor community. And we cannot stay and say, when the conflict happen in countries like Somalia or other emerging conflict countries, there is a fragility of institutional capacity. And that vacuum was filled by other actors. And how long, we need to ask how long that actors want to continue to be in the field. How much they are ready to transfer their knowledge, skills, and expertise to the national governments. How they allow national government to is the one who defining the priorities, the one who defining where they put the emphasis. Are we clear about that? I don't think so. So we need to really have that kind of discussion. What is missing is not data. And what is missing is a political will to engage. And nations who receive the humanitarian assistance, they develop kind of a conspiracy theories. And there is other competitors. This world now is getting more competitive world, where the other actors are coming and saying those countries, they wanted to rely on humanitarian handouts. They don't want to invest the critical and necessary critical infrastructure in your country. They want you to stay forever handouts. And we are the alternative providing the critical infrastructures. I think we need to wake up. What is wrong? And not only data missing, but I think it is, and that's why we, as Somalis, when we're addressing the food insecurity, we see that people left their traditional livelihoods of animal husbandry or the agricultural livelihoods, because I was talking one of the key agricultural people in the country, and he told me he stopped producing any sort of agricultural activity because there is no critical infrastructure, and I mean in transportation. He said there is no market access to my products, and he said, and sometimes the one we produce is cheaper. The one imported outside of the country, the product imported outside the country is cheaper than the one produced inside the country, because of the lack of infrastructure, transportation, and other challenges of insecurity, including insecurity. So he stopped and farming his farm, and he come to the to have another business in the capital. So I think we need to that kind of investment. And it is necessary, and whether it is infrastructure, agricultural infrastructure, technology, training the people or those who are in that field, and so on.
Thank you. Rain, what are your thoughts on this? We've often said that many of the disasters that we see across the world, including now food insecurity, are in some cases they're seasonal, in others others perhaps less seasonal, but they're certainly perhaps not exactly predictable, but we expect them, and therefore we expect that they could be prevented. So what is it that is missing here? What is the Indeed, I don't think data answers everything. We have got the evidence that we need in order to act. So what do you think is the missing link? Or at least from FAO's perspective, what is it?
So I think indeed the Special Envoy touched on some key issues, and you've echoed it as well. I mean, if we think about the collective response to prevent famine in the Horn of Africa and respond to the drought, I mean, one of the things that still is really disturbing when we look at the work that's underway. I mean, we were able collectively to avoid famine in the official sense, but we had early warning data. I mean, let's remember that when the international response mobilized at scale, it was after 5 successive failed rains. It wasn't after 1 failed season or 2 failed seasons, and yet that data was there. Those alarm bells were ringing, and importantly, the response models are in place. The team in Somalia, I think, has done incredible work through years and years, decades of experience, to understand how practically water interventions, nutrition, health interventions, in-kind assistance, cash support, and agricultural interventions come together in a very sort of tangible way in communities. It's not as if there is technical rigor and strength behind here that can be mobilized, but it requires funding and political will. But just to say on the funding piece, I think we need to be sufficiently nuanced, right? We always talk about there's insufficient funding, and there is insufficient funding, but it has to be funding at the right time and focused on the right types of activities, right? And so if we know that it requires a multi-sectoral approach to prevent famine and to also prevent displacement in different settings, it doesn't help if just 2 of those sectors are funded at the right time and in scale. And I was struck. I had the honor to meet the Special Envoy in Somalia when I was there recently, and we were also up in Baidoa and met with people who had been displaced from rural areas, and the story was the same for everyone. Everyone that had been displaced had lost all of their livestock and had no crops standing in the field, right? So conversely, that tells us anything that we can do from an anticipatory fashion to keep livestock alive. And again, we know how to do this as well with, support for access to water and emergency animal feed and the type of simple but effective veterinary support that's impactful in these areas. These are actions that not only strengthen food security of households, but prevent displacement in really tangible, concrete terms. So political will is an issue. Having the right type of funding mix is clearly there. Data is still important for the nuanced programming decisions and telling us where we need to go. But the tragedy here is, I think, that we understand the actions that need to be taken, and what we need is more, maybe even less human decision-making in the decision-making processes about when to move forward and not, and have more automatic triggers to mobilize the right type of responses.
Great, thank you. I'm just looking at the time, and I would like to give the floor to our audience and to ask a few questions. But I don't know if you have a few final thoughts, Evelyn, on what we were talking about earlier. This is all sort of connected, but again, how well or badly do you think are we doing when it comes to building evidence on the basis of people's actual needs and wants and their own aspirations? How good are we at listening to people? Big question, but if you could just maybe give a couple of examples from where you've seen it actually work.
Yeah, well, I think that the war in Ukraine has been a turning point, obviously in many different ways, but particularly on how the global food system is failing, because it became much more aware, people became much more aware, main stakeholders and donors became much more aware of how incredibly dependent low-income countries are on imports of both food and fertilizers, and bringing the voices of local farmers to these international stakeholders has really helped to open their eyes. Which doesn't mean that practices will change, that policies will change, but I've really seen in the past year that there's much more receptiveness to that narrative around the dependency of low-income countries on this failed global food system and the need to invest more in local and sustainable farming in these countries. So we're obviously not there yet, but I have seen a shift in the narrative and the willingness to listen and to the willingness to invest in these kind of food systems. So my hope is that that will continue, and that we will not see, these famines that were lurking, that Somalia managed to escape, but only barely. And this is why I also very much agree with both speakers about investing so much in anticipatory action. That's really the key. We cannot keep from going from famine to displacement crisis. We really need to invest in development systems and act before the humanitarians arrive, because then we're just way too late.
Yeah, thanks. Wilhelmina, do you think that that the recommendations that are in IRIS and what national statistical offices can offer actually includes building more, building up an evidence base that will support anticipatory action better?
Thanks so much. And yes, I'll briefly touch on that, but also would like to react to the panel. I think if properly implemented, that is, that will deliver baselines that are important for anticipatory action. We know that good quality data is the cornerstone for anticipatory action. But again, I would like to highlight that really understanding people's plans, intentions, context will deliver even more, important information for anticipatory action. But just to maybe react to the panel, I think we tend to maybe hide behind the statement that there is enough data. There is data, I agree, but I think it is quite challenging in terms to work, in terms of what is needed for political will. Data can really be a cornerstone to leverage that. And we're not so good in working together. And I think when we talk about, implementing the nexus in many different countries coming together, we're talking about, no single agency can actually implement solutions by themselves. Data can be a key piece to unlock and build political will. From JIF's perspective, these are very slow processes, but these collective, collaborative data processes have the opportunity to unlock political will, to build political will. We're seeing it in many different countries. Just Mexico is one of them that recently, based on this collaborative data process, for the very first time included IDPs in their national and local, actually state-level development plan, and is discussing the issue on policy level. We see Honduras that just endorsed the IDP bill. We see already the impact of these collective data processes in the Philippines that have informed community level and province level and also at national level policies. So I think the data maybe is there, but I think what we need to get better at really is on how to work together based on that data. And I think that is still a very big challenge, even though the data is there. And that is also a challenge for the production of official statistics. So it's not just a challenge in terms of the production of overall data, but it is also a challenge in national systems for national statistical offices within the national statistical system to do that together. And I think that is what actually builds political will and has this transformative power of leveraging the issue at the highest levels with government and the international community.
Thanks. Excellent last points. I think it's a great segue now into the Q&A. So I'm going to put my glasses on so that I can actually see who's here. And happy to take questions from the floor. I will also be looking at my phone, not out of rudeness, but also receiving questions from the online audience as we speak. But we're we'll give priority to those of you in the room. So who would like to start? We have colleagues with microphones in the room. Don't be shy. Yes? Oh, we have, yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation, and thank you to IDMC for the work on this crucial aspect. I wanted to ask, we've been talking about countries that are facing the severe consequences that are not the primary contributors to the climatic, let's say, pollution. So my question wanted to be, in light of this, do you think that what the international community does in terms of mitigation of climate change, in terms of greenhouse gases emissions, and also in fields, in certain fields such as water security or reforestation or soil preservation, does this have an effect on internal displacement? And if this is international action could be improved in some way, how could it be done in order for this to be on a further means and a further way to put in place in order to tackle the issue and protect the internal displacements? So, thank you.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the question is, does climate action have a direct positive effect on reducing internal displacement?
Yes,
yes.
And if it does, is it enough what it's being done, or if there's some aspects that can be improved?
Great, thank you. We'll take another question from the Permanent Mission of Nigeria here, please. Thanks.
Thank you to the panel for the insightful discussion. Let me begin by commending Ms. Belak and her team and her worthy team for the strident efforts to provide us with the comprehensive 2023 grid report with focus on the challenges related to food insecurity as a major driver on internal displacement. We have continued to witness exponential rise in the number of displaced persons globally. This is as a result of conflicts and lasting impacts of climate change. In Nigeria, in the year 2022, we saw more than 3 million persons displaced as a result of unprecedented flooding that affected many states across the country. Conversely, the Lake Chad Basin region, comprising Chad, Cameroon, Niger, and Nigeria, has experienced extreme droughts. Reports indicate that the Lake Chad, as water source for more than 30 million persons, has shrunken by 90% since 1960. There is no doubt that this situation has exacerbated food insecurity and increased the number of displaced persons in the Lake Chad Basin. Nigeria acknowledges the critical role of this report in assisting governments to adequately account for IDPs and ensure their inclusion in national development plans. This could ensure effective identification of their needs in sync with disaggregated data, formulation of specific policies that engender action on internal displacement and food insecurity. This report equally is critical to shaping the discourse on internal displacement that is driven by food insecurity, as well as supporting the work of multi-stakeholders engaged in addressing the many challenges of internal displacement. Let me conclude with a poser for IDMC, and I would like to find out, how does the IDMC coordinate its findings with other stakeholders, such as UNHCR, IOM, and the UNSG Special Advisor on Solutions to Internal Displacement, who have a mandate of providing solutions to internal displacement? Thank you.
Thank you. There's Camilla here from NRC, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Camilla Vassing from the Norwegian Refugee Council. And first, just wanted to congratulate IDMC on another fantastic report. And of course, as NRC, we're very proud that IDMC is part of our organization. So, but just the question, to come back to the nexus, because I think, several have mentioned this is key to addressing both food insecurity and internal displacement. And I think you, Ryan, you mentioned, we need the right funding mixes. But then what are so we kind of know a little bit what we need to do, I think, and you mentioned several measures in relation to funding. But what are some of the obstacles that is sort of preventing this alignment of, humanitarian development and now climate financing? And how could we address some of those obstacles, do you think? Maybe also building on the Somalia experience, what have you seen? Thank you.
Great. I suggest I've also got some questions that have come from the online audience. So let's take this this first round. There's a question here for Mr. Paulsen. Do you have any suggestions on practical ways we can help tackle food insecurity for IDPs displaced by conflict where insecurity makes it difficult for them to move around? And an example given from northern Nigeria here. So access issues and how to work on these very complex issues when access is a problem. But who would like to, I'll just maybe ask Mr. Abdi Shakur about your thoughts on the question that Camilla asked on what you see as key obstacles to really giving sense to that nexus.
I think key obstacle is before I answer that question, the gentleman's question about the role of climate yes. Is, the most affected countries by the climate change, including Somalia or other parts of Africa, and are the least recipients of the climate finance. Mm. And the reason being that they are not qualified for having access to the climate finance. When you look into the compliance that been demanded to have that access, it is very challenging, and those countries doesn't have that capacity to fulfill or to meet that criteria, and they become least recipients of the climate finance. At the same time, they are the one who are most affected by the climate change. So we were urging and asking global community to look into the fragile countries and how they can access to the climate finance in order to address the causes of the climate change in their countries. What is here, it is lack of cooperation. That's number one. I don't think that there is a cooperation between humanitarian community and development community, and as well as other actors. In my country, I can speak Somali specifically. There's a lack of cooperation. Even data collection, everybody collects the data. And when you ask the IDPs people, they say, there's so many people come to us asking us interview, questions, collecting data. We're confused. They are confused. Yeah. And every organization has to first go and make assessment. That's the natural things. But how many of them are making the same assessment and same data collection? That's the question. So lack of cooperation is what's missing. And come a bit, lack of political will to change the direction, to look into the more investing in anticipatory and prevention and resilience and our projects.
Mm. Would you like to respond to that? Yeah.
Also on the climate finance, which is a great question, and I can say, and we all know this, that rich countries are completely insufficient in funding the different funds that are available. And I want to highlight two issues in particular that have an impact on food security and displacement. First is that it was a huge success of particularly low-income countries and the Global South that the Loss and Damage Fund was established at the latest COPs. But now that fund needs to be funded and filled. And there's been lots of promises by rich countries to do that, but it hasn't happened yet. And these are the kind of funds that are really necessary for these countries to recover from climate shocks, such as land that's no longer farmable. So if these funds are not there, then countries cannot act upon that. And the second topic is that if funds are made available, most of the time or in the majority of the cases, they are in the form of loans, which needs to be repaid. And this is pressing enormously on debt of countries who already have low income and already are suffering from debt and the repayment of that. And debt that needs to be paid cannot be put in local services, in education, in health, in local and sustainable farming. So that's another way in which rich countries are really harming the way that low-income countries can deal with the shocks that come from the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you. Rain, would you like to say a few words on that double question on the nexus? And do you agree with what's been said on the problem being mostly of coordination? And then also, if you have an answer to the question that was asked online on access issues and what is possible? What is it possible to do in places that are so insecure that access is a problem?
I mean, these are big questions. Yeah. Maybe just on the last one first, and I may not fully answer the question, but just as an example, we see thankfully time and time again that it's actually possible to do a lot more than one might imagine, even in the most extreme circumstances and conflict-affected settings and situations. I returned this last weekend from interagency mission to Yemen, a country many of you are probably well familiar with and maybe have worked in as well. But 8 years of conflict, a majority, I think it's about 80% of the population have in need of humanitarian assistance, and of course significant levels of internal displacement. But even in a context like Yemen, one of the things that FAO is doing, for example, is bringing together newly displaced communities with people that are returning to those same communities from a state of displacement, with host communities to deal with really pressing issues that affect everyone. So access to water and water infrastructure, and using water user associations as a way to strengthen social cohesion and focus on returnees when it comes then to their socioeconomic integration in these. We've got greenhouse projects that are also allowing returnees a source of revenue there. And I mean, there's a lot of detail around this, but the point is, even in situations that are classified as, for many years this was described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, it's possible to do things that are well beyond just an immediate provision of assistance, that focus on building on agencies, strengthening capabilities, and use the resource that those that have been internally displaced represent to a community, right? This isn't just a negative or a burden. There are many different examples and ways in which this can function well. And in Yemen too, I mean, just to say even longer term work, we've been working as FAO on value chain development around the milk sector. And I mean, this is a humanitarian crisis, but a lot is still possible, and I know all the organizations in the room have compelling examples too. But so a lot that can be done. And again, I think what's important there is that we avoid falling into the trap of narrow classifications of what a context represents and what people within that context are able to do or not able to do. And I think this links into the Nexus conversation ultimately, right? Because it really is about all of us challenging long-held assumptions and working differently based on evidence and based on experience. So apologies if I missed a few of the points there.
That's fine. I think that's great. I have another question from the online audience, but if there's, yes, Sam from IOM.
Yeah, thanks. Sam Grundy from IOM. We've heard about Somalia, and I think reference was made to Darfur, in both the contexts where solutions to displacement are urban solutions. I know in particular, having spent time in Somalia, Baidoa and Kismayo, they both have very good government-led solutions programs. So my question, leading to a sort of data gap question, is if rural areas are being significantly depopulated, do we not need to be addressing that data gap by understanding the changing means of production in those areas and understanding what assistance needs to be provided to sort of accommodate this new rural-urban configuration?
Who would like to take that question? Wilhelmina?
Maybe a few examples. I mean, addressing the data gap there, and I think from urban profiling practice from our end, what we see is again what of course two key elements in understanding those differences is looking at the area, so really looking at the area-based approaches and working with local authorities who need that information in order to design those programs and really understand the differences rural-urban here. And that local authorities in those exercises, including pre-invasion Ukraine, in Lugansk Oblast and many other places, the importance of what local authorities are expressing as important is to understand the complex systems, be those rural or urban, with all of those populations that they are servicing. So really people and places again, I think, as Rain said, in terms of the context. And what local authorities find important really is the methods and the pathways of coming together to do this. And I think really it goes back to coordination and collaboration from the very local level. So having the information prepared in a sense that it does look at area-based approaches, it does look at all the different population groups that are serviced, it does look at the services, it looks at the demand and supply side, and provides a pathway for working together. So in a sense, my answer would be in terms of the data gap, it's more of a there's more of an opportunity of coming together through a process than having, than really a data gap. It's really about understanding those systems, both urban and rural, and coming together to do so and program accordingly.
Thank you, Wilhelmina. I'm just aware of the time. We're going to have to start wrapping up. I'd just like to answer the question that was asked by Nigeria on the way in which IDMC coordinates its own findings with other UN agencies and partners from the UN system. Of course, IDMC itself is not, in most cases, not collecting primary data. We rely on the data that comes to us from all of our UN partners, UNHCR, IOM, and many, many others. And our role is really to analyze that data, triangulate it, and sort of feed it back to the community as trends analyses, as insights into what this actually means. So it's a very close collaboration with across the UN system. It's a long-standing collaboration, and it's one that I think has become even stronger over the last few years as we've tried to work together to start filling the gaps. So, and then you asked a question about how we are working with the special advisor. Obviously, we're a close partner, I hope, at least to the special advisor's office, and providing him with the evidence that he needs to make the case at the international level, and with the different governments whom he's trying to influence and to work with. We're providing him with data on the scale, the scope of internal displacement, and in particular on trying to sort of help him shape the narrative, particularly around prevention and early warning when it comes to disaster displacement. I think it's 30 minutes past 4, and we really need to wrap up. So I would like to turn to all of our panelists, first and foremost, to say thank you to all of you. It's been a really great conversation, and it's been a pleasure having you here with us in Geneva. Really appreciate you coming, for some of you from a long way away. So I'm just going to give you a minute each for just a final word. If you would like this audience today to go away with one thought in their mind, what would it be? Mr. Abdi Shakur.
Climate is the most, a driving crisis in my country, or this drought or flood, and we need to address that and focus more on how the nexus between the climate and conflict and humanitarian are being interlinked and addressed. Secondly, how we can focus on investment more in resilience and anticipatory and prevention rather than response. And the third is how we can work together, government, humanitarian agencies, and the donor community, and effectively addressing these recurring and climate-driven and disasters.
Thank you very much. Evelyn.
Thank you. I would like to end with, and then copy the words that Mr. Abdishakir used in his earlier intervention, which is about political will and how that is key. And that political will just needs to be there because, as I said before, there is enough food in the world. We just have to decide that it needs to reach the people that need it the most and that it's affordable for those people. There's also really enough funds in the world. We saw during the COVID response that countries in the global north invested trillions of millions of dollars into their local economies, and there was political will to do that. There was also political will in the EU last year to tax excessive wealth and windfall profits of companies that made huge profits out of the energy crisis. So political will can be there, it needs to be there, to wrap up all these funds and to make sure that it goes to these loss and damage funds that we discussed earlier, that it goes to development funds to build resilience, and that it goes to grants to low-income countries so that they can invest in resilience of their own population. So let me end by saying, when there's a will, there's a way.
Great, thank you. Great last words. Rain.
Alexandra, thank you. So maybe just to come back again to this headline topic of the relationship between internal displacement and food security. And if we had another few hours, it would have been great to maybe come back and look at another angle, which is, the role then that agricultural livelihoods plays as an answer to durable solutions to internal displacement. And I think the report this year is incredibly important because it makes the linkage between so many of these questions, and hopefully we can pursue these discussions. We're certainly keen on the FAO side to continue to do that, but agriculture is a key part of the answer to durable solutions to internal displacement is the headline I'd put out there.
Great, thank you very much. And finally, Wilhelmina, you have the last word.
That's great and fantastic. I hope I use it wisely. But let me stay on the political will, because I think that is very strongly coming up. And from our experience, maybe 3 elements that we believe are conducive to building this important political will. The first one being really, sometimes you need a neutral broker. We are an interagency service that really is tasked to support all of these discussions. But you also need the evidence that brings together, that really builds the political will. And I think here we have a momentum to really invest in that and to really leverage it at scale. But lastly, I think as highlighted by all of you, we also need a way of working together, really the collaborative element, the process of getting there. And with all those 3, we're able to see great examples of building political will.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much to all of you for attending this launch. For those of you who are here present with us in the room, you're very welcome to join us for reception. And for those of you who have been joining us and following this online, thank you very much for your time and for your interest in this topic. Thank you again to all of our panelists. It's been a real pleasure. Have a good rest of the day, evening for some of you. See you soon. Thanks.